Welcome to this narrated PowerPoint on the power of formative assessment. Of all the developments in the field of measurement and assessment, I find this one the most exciting in terms of improving student learning. Let's start the presentation by looking at the learning targets. Distinguish formative assessment from summative assessment, and conclude why formative assessment should be used in an instructional setting. And select recommended strategies to support effective formative assessment. These are all objectives that you should be able to accomplish by the end of this PowerPoint. There are three essential questions that will shape our work together, and each will be revisited throughout the PowerPoint presentation. Please take a look at these. How is formative assessment distinguished from summative assessment? Why should formative assessment be used in an instructional setting? And what are the recommended strategies to support effective formative assessment? Now, here are a few suggestions about how to work through this PowerPoint. Consider information that you'd like to remember. Consider instructional practices that you'd like to continue or to end. Consider instructional practices that you'd like to start. And also consider additional questions that you might still have. I suggest that you pause the presentation periodically and take some notes in each of these four areas, either with paper and pencil or electronically. So let's jump into our first question. How is formative assessment distinguished from summative assessment? Before we look at this distinction, though, we should really consider what assessment is. And according to Miller, Lin, and Gronlund, assessment includes the full range of procedures used to gain information about student learning. Now, such procedures can include assessment tools like informal observation, performances, homework, tests, quizzes, projects, oral reports, and essays, for example. With many of the upcoming slides, I'll give you some time to read the text on the screen before adding my comments. Two common terms used to describe different types of assessment are formative and summative. While the focus of this discussion is formative assessment, it helps to provide a clear distinction between these two terms by defining both. Summative assessments, like photographs, give teachers a snapshot of student learning at a given moment in time. Although there's certainly a time and a place for summative assessment, the limitation is that these do little to perpetuate student learning because summative assessment typically does not help teachers respond with appropriate instructional adjustments, and the results are typically not communicated soon enough for students to improve their work before moving on to new material. Please take time to read this slide. In contrast to the snapshot of student learning gained from summative assessment, a formative assessment serves as a continuous moving picture of student learning progress. Stiggins adds that formative assessment is designed to advance, not merely check on student learning. Just read through the next slide by yourself, if you would, please. Please read this slide now. The crucial difference between formative assessment and summative assessment is not the type of action, but rather how it is used. The action could look a lot like a summative assessment. However, if it is used during the learning for learning, rather than at the end when it is an assessment of the learning, then action becomes formative. In other words, the same assessment tool, a quiz or a project, for example, could be a summative or formative assessment depending on how it's used. Throughout the process of using formative assessment, Teachers need to be continuously adjusting instruction based on the results of the classroom assessments. Consequently, the actions taken by teachers because of the formative assessment process are just as important as utilizing the process in the first place. Without adjustments to instructional practices, the impact of student learning will be hindered. Now let's take a look at our second essential question. Why should formative assessment be used in an instructional setting? In 1998, Paul Black and Dylan Williams published a landmark study on formative assessment that reviewed research in numerous countries. Their work included kindergartners all the way through college students. You can read now what their findings were. Please take time to read this quote. It's interesting to note that Williams' study is a meta-analysis that was based on an examination of over 4,000 studies over the last 40 years. Take time to read this slide now, please. Additionally, formative assessment helps students know what they need to better understand throughout the class time and the lessons. This allows them to be fully prepared for formative assessments in the future. Good formative assessment guides learning for the student on what they need to focus on. So it's not just at the end of something, but it's really something that can be used to act as a springboard to propel students into the future in deeper learning and understanding. Let's look at one additional benefit of formative assessment. Please read through this now. Brookhart, Moss, and Long state this paradox, quote, "The teacher is in control of how much control the student experiences." This research shows that one of the greatest strengths of formative assessment is that it develops student autonomy. Let's move to our third essential question now. What are recommended strategies to support formative assessment? In 1989, Royce Stadler clarified the implementation of formative assessment into three very simple questions that our students fundamentally want answers to. Where am I going? Where am I now? And how can I close the gap? These three questions emphasize the fact that formative assessment is not assessment of learning, but rather for learning. Let's now look at the 7 research-based strategies to support effective formative assessment. Number 1, provide clear learning targets. I'll give you a chance to read through this slide. The question, where am I going, can be clarified by 2 strategies. First, Jan Chappie notes that when instruction is guided by clearly defined learning targets, students become motivated and achievement improves. And secondly, examples of strong and weak work help students understand what the expectations are to meet the learning target. The weak examples help students avoid common mistakes or stumbling blocks. These examples give students the confidence that they're on the right track, and as a result, they often move ahead with much more motivation because they have less fear of failure. They know what they need to do to succeed. Student motivation and achievement will rise when students can answer the question, where am I going? Number 2, create effective learning tasks. I'll give you a little time to read now. The carefully designed questions, assignments, projects, and activities should fulfill the goals of keeping the students engaged and of gauging understanding of the entire class, rather than the comprehension of just a few students. Number 3, provide feedback that moves learners toward meeting the learning targets. I'll give you a little time to read now. Teachers should provide feedback that moves learners toward meeting the learning targets. that focuses on the development of skills, understanding, and mastery, and that treats mistakes as learning opportunities. The question, "Where am I now?" is answered by providing feedback. Just as Cawley and Macmillan pointed out when defining formative assessment, for students to benefit from feedback, it has to be quality feedback and should occur during the learning. The most effective teachers deliver feedback quickly, specifically, and spontaneously. Teachers should point out where the student has done a good job meeting the learning target and where the student still needs improvement. Both the positive and the constructive feedback must be specific to motivate the student. Just as a coach allows a player to make mistakes and learn from them in practice, teachers must create an environment that gives students permission to keep working through their mistakes during the learning process. The teacher has to be prepared to make instructional adjustments that vary from class to class and student to student. For formative assessment to function properly, the evidence must be used to adjust both teaching and learning. Let's take a look at each suggestion on an individual basis. Number 1, feedback can be detrimental if teachers don't pay special attention to the level of understanding the student has of the learning target. Providing feedback to students who have little or no understanding of the learning target becomes detrimental because the student now not only can't understand the learning target, but also can't understand what the teacher is trying to say to fix it. When students have not even gained a partial grasp of the learning target, the teacher should spend time with further instruction rather than feedback. Number 2, feedback will not matter or have a large impact on students if it's not given in a timely manner. And number 3, just as coaches need to avoid always telling the player how to always fix a mistake on the court or field, teachers need to rely on the student's partial understanding of the learning target to think and explore solutions on their own. Far too often, coaches, teachers, even parents, short-circuit the learning process by giving students too much direction or actually doing it for them. Teachers need to identify the misconception for the student, but then ask strategic questions that allow the student to think critically about the problem. Finally, teachers can avoid detrimental feedback by limiting the amount of advice to what students can reasonably act on. The gap between where the student is and where he or she needs to be may be so large that to get a student to mastery of the learning target may take multiple pieces of advice. Students differ in their ability to take in and work on corrective information. As a result, teachers will have to use their best judgment and give differing amounts of advice to different students. Giving too little correction can decrease motivation and achievement as well. If you are around golfers much, you often hear them say things such as, "Stop thinking, just hit the ball." When golfers or students get too much advice in their minds, it actually keeps them from functioning at it. Teachers need to pay attention to the student's need and give only enough feedback so the student can actually act on it. Here's some interesting information about ineffective feedback. Let's look at these on a point-by-point basis. Number 1, it's especially harmful for teachers to praise high-achieving students for completing an easy task. Low-achieving students almost always require teachers to step in and give advice without the student taking the initiative to ask for it. However, a teacher should never offer unsolicited help to high achievers. Number 2, unless feedback is given and there is a place and time to show improvement from feedback, the effect of the feedback will never really be known. And number 3, the biggest connection observed through the studies was the fact that students often don't understand how to use the feedback appropriately when it's provided by teachers. Feedback itself is not enough. Students need to understand exactly how to use the feedback to close the gap between their current level of performance and the learning target. And number 4, when given ineffectively, feedback from formative assessments can lead to a lack of student motivation to utilize the feedback. In her research, Orell observed that failure to respond to feedback is sometimes partially due to the fact that feedback was not given in a way that students could clearly understand it, but it was codified in the expert language of academic disciplines. Additionally, Orell noted that the research indicates that feedback primarily focused on student errors has a negative impact on students' egos. Within the field of formative assessment, there's a good deal of debate about the appropriateness of using grades along with formative assessments. The research on this seems pretty convincing, and two critical points are listed on this slide. Interestingly, when feedback is given only as a grade or a mark, improvement doesn't seem to follow. It is understood that a mark or a grade is what many students are interested in, but may not be quite enough to show students what to do to improve. Stadler points out the importance of feedback over just a mark on student work to aid them in finding direction to improve. Various researchers have come to the conclusion that students who receive a grade rather than feedback tend to compare themselves to others. This tends to create a learner who is more worried about the mark on their paper and the competition between peers, rather than the learning process of themselves. Terrace explains that a grade could be counterproductive on a student's work. Her study shows that students say when a grade is given before feedback, the feedback is not read or used. Students tend to glance quickly over feedback even when there is a mark at the bottom of the page. In conclusion, the research does seem to show that when students are given only comments without a grade attainment, they're more apt to see the feedback as helping them improve their skills, leading to task involvement. And they outperform students that are only given grades for the assessment. The fourth aspect that teachers should practice is attributing student success and mastery to effort, which suggests to students that they are capable of learning. This leads students to believe that their successes are due primarily to their abilities and efforts, and thus it strengthens their motivation to complete even more challenging work. On the other hand, motivation is reduced when teachers unknowingly communicate a lack of belief in their abilities or overuse any of these three types of feedback: communicating pity after a student failure, expressing praise for student success, especially for easy tasks, and for offering unwanted help, especially to high-achieving students. Praise should be avoided as it highlights the student's ability. Students often view ability as something that he or she was born with, and therefore they have no control over the outcomes it produces. Students can develop learned helplessness when praise is given and the recognition for success gets attributed to the student's ability rather than the student's effort. The student develops a concept or worldview that all of their accomplishments have little to do with their effort, which they have a lot of influence over, but rather their ability, which they are born with. This problem does not seem to be an issue until the student is placed in a situation in which they question their ability to succeed. If they think all their accomplishments are a result of their ability, they will question whether or not their ability is adequate for the job at hand. A fifth best practice is that teachers should urge students to be owners of their own learning by encouraging self-assessment. This self-assessment enables students to monitor and guide their own work and supports their growth into being independent learners. I'll give you a chance to read the slide now. Teachers can also address the question, "Where am I now?" by teaching students to self-assess, reflect, and set goals. Black and William argue that the link between formative assessment and self-assessment is inevitable. Motivation and achievement increases dramatically when teachers allow students to become full partners in the learning process. Students who participate in the thoughtful analysis of quality work to identify its critical elements or to internalize valued achievement targets do become better performers. Self-assessment is a three-step process in which students monitor and evaluate their thinking and then identify strategies to improve their learning. First, students must judge their own work. Teachers can encourage this while they provide feedback by asking leading questions to help students think about what they know or have mastered and what they still need to work on. Second, students need to identify the differences between their own work and the desired learning target. And then finally, students need to find and commit to learning activities that will improve their understanding. Self-assessment walks students through this process and gives them direction and motivation to follow through. So why does self-assessment create such a strong motivation in students? Studies have shown that self-assessment develops both student autonomy as well as valuable decision-making skills. Colley and McMillan noted that students who practice self-assessment not only gain the confidence that they are in control of their learning, but also the ability to know what to do and when to do it. Brookhart contends that when students understand the purpose of assessment and that it's for helping them identify where they are in the process toward mastery of an outcome, they become the owners of their learning. The sixth best practice is that teachers should help students set attainable goals for improvement, and this addresses Stadler's final question: how can I close the gap? When students set goals and can clearly observe their progress toward goal mastery, their self-efficacy improves as they become more confident that when they put forth the effort necessary, they can be successful. In particular, goals that refer to very specific performance standards tend to be most effective in building self-efficacy. Once students understand where their gap is, they can also use this time to select learning activities to help close the gap. And this is certainly a time that teachers can add valuable suggestions about materials and resources of value. The seventh best practice is that teachers should encourage students to become instructional resources for one another through peer assessment. I'll give you time to read this slide now. Peer assessment, interestingly, develops students' important collaborative skills as well as objectivity needed for necessary self-assessment. Stadler's final question, how can I close the gap, leads students to think critically of ways to improve their learning so that they can master the learning target. Based on self and peer assessment, the teacher needs to be able to give students focused instruction that addresses the learning gaps. Chappie believes that this instruction should be broken down into short, focused tasks that scaffold the learning. This allows the students to pay more attention to the more important themes of the learning target. When teachers have successfully helped fill in the learning gaps, students may just need a little more practice. For those of you that have colleagues teaching similar material, I urge you to consider using common formative assessments. Reading this slide will help define what I mean by this. DeFore reminds us of the research that notes higher levels of student achievement when teachers work as collaborative teams. Please allow me to suggest a four-part process that can be used for building common formative assessments. First of all, teachers must act in accordance with the belief that all students are capable of learning at high levels. The institution must promote a growth mindset that attributes student effort to their learning success rather than the innate ability that they possess. And number two, a common assessment is then developed for each of the essential learning targets throughout a unit of instruction. Sound assessment design principles should be used to match the learning objectives with appropriate tasks. And three, after administering a common formative assessment, teams should work together to score the assessments. Dufour and Marzano call this part of the process the heart of formative assessment. Conversations about student work across classrooms prevents individual teacher bias and assumptions from reducing the validity of the results. And number 4, the team can use the assessment information to determine areas of strength and weaknesses in the curriculum, the teaching strategies that were most effective, and develop a plan for responding to student needs. So, thanks for working through this narrated PowerPoint with me. I'd like to return to our learning targets now, and I'd also like you to respond to each target in writing or in your head. Feel free to advance to the third learning target when you've responded to each of these targets. This particular target is the most critical in my estimation. And as you consider this target, you may wish to return to your notes about, first of all, information you'd like to remember, or second, instructional practices that you'd like to continue or perhaps stop, and third, instructional practices you'd like to start, and 4, additional questions that you might still have. Let's finish off with this concluding thought. Changing our mental models about what we teach, how we teach it, and how we assess student learning growth will take some getting used to. Such changes require open-mindedness, flexibility, patience, and courage. Thanks for working through this PowerPoint with me, and I do pray that God will bless your teaching and your assessment efforts. If you're interested in pursuing the topic of formative assessment more fully, please consider the complete reference section that's found in the next 4 slides of this presentation.